You're listening to SUGi Talks. Along with the rest of the world during the pandemic, Jason Williams, aka the Cloud Gardener, was forced indoors. While on furlough from his hospitality job, he decided to try out a few plants on his balcony. Up on the 18th floor of a high rise in Manchester City, he went from struggling with one marigold flower to transforming his balcony into a thriving ecosystem. Just 3 years on, he's now a multi award winning gardener and a successful UK influencer, intertwining his own mental health journey into his gardening. With a focus on accessibility, community, and urban biodiversity, he helps city dwellers make the most of their spaces. Today, Jason is committed to working with urban developers and local councils to help design policies that make way for more accessible green spaces. I had the pleasure to speak to Jason from his home in Manchester, and we talked about his high-speed journey into gardening. Hi, Jason. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're super happy to have you on. I think the way you communicate and your advocacy for urban greening and gardening is really amazing. But I also think your story is really interesting. So, to kick us off, could you talk a little bit about your background and how you first started into gardening?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Jason Williams, also known as the Cloud Gardener, and originally I am from the wonderful Croydon in South London, and I actually went and studied languages, and I always wanted to be a teacher, but I didn't get to finish my degree. Instead, I ended up going into hospitality, and I was in hospitality for around about 10 years or so before we got to COVID. And through furlough, I then found gardening, and the rest is history, I guess.
So you're widely known for your cloud garden, your balcony garden. But for those people who aren't familiar, could you describe it a little bit?
So it's an 18 floor garden. It's around about a meter and a half wide and around about 7 meters long. And on the garden, I grow all sorts of different fruits and veg. So I grow lemons, cucumber melons, tomatoes, chilies, peppers. I'm just looking down the pots now, trying to remind myself. Passion fruits,
Ooh.
all sorts of different herbs. And then I also have a fish pond as well. In fact, I have a fish pond, I have a pollinator pond on there, and I also have a very small edible pond too.
Yeah, it's stunning. The cloud garden always looks incredible. So I think it's really interesting that basically in 3 years you went from working in hospitality to becoming an award-winning gardener, multi-award-winning gardener, and a popular influencer. So what happened?
I ask myself this every day, like, how have I got here? So yeah, I started gardening on my balcony during lockdown, and we just we couldn't do anything. The only thing we could do was either go to a supermarket or go food shopping. And so, oh, sorry, I'll go to a garden center. And I went to the garden center. I picked up a few plants, and I tried to take care of them on my balcony. But I was having some real troubles, and then that's when I kind of learned that actually there's no social media or teaching mechanisms out there for people with small space gardens. Um, and so I decided to kind of just rip up the rule book because everything that everyone was telling me to do just wasn't working. So I created my whole social media platforms after I found that I had a handle on what it was that I was doing. And, I remember when I first started, I used to get a little bit of hate from experienced gardeners because they were telling me that I wasn't doing things the right way. And so, for example, for me, what I learned in my garden, because there's a glass railing, it amplifies the heat. It kind of changes my seasons a little bit. And so I would start things a little bit earlier than other people. And people were like, oh, wow, you shouldn't be starting this now. You don't know what you're doing. You shouldn't be spreading this. And I'm like, my space is not the same as yours. Two things can be true at the same time. So for me, this works in my space, and this is what I'm going to show people. If they have got similar spaces to mine, this is what they could be doing, and could potentially be why they are experiencing failure in their garden. Um, and so I had to kind of really figure it out on my own. And it was kind of like my own mini science projects during furlough. And I will say, actually, just on a side note for me,
Hmm.
although people would consider me a gardener, but gardening is not my favorite thing on the garden. I love watching nature and seeing it all come together. And so I've had to really learn a lot and kind of equate the garden to being its own unique ecosystem. And once I made these understandings, I was then able to kind of be a better gardener. So yeah, it's been a really interesting journey.
Totally. And also, biodiversity is something that's really important for us at SUGi too. At 18 stories up, what have you learned about biodiversity, and how do you maintain balance in your own little ecosystem up there?
So when I first started in 2020, I think it was, when I first started, it was all very much about self-sufficiency. And so every single one of my containers was dedicated to growing some kind of food. And I didn't have very many pollinators visiting my garden at all. And in fact, I used to go out and pollinate everything myself with cotton buds. And I used to do things like spray my garden with washing up liquid and water to get rid of all
Mm.
of the aphids because I have a ton of aphids on this damn
Oh
garden.
no. Mm.
But again, I realized it was because my plants were stressed quite a lot of the time because of the heat, and so that attracted in quite a large number of pests to my garden. And I one year I had a really terrible year. I can't remember why, but I think it was it was a very dramatic time. I had quite a few of my seedlings in my little greenhouse on the garden, and the greenhouse blew over, and all of my seedlings for that whole year were cast along the balcony. And I rescued as many as I could, but it just wasn't enough. A lot of them had really perished. And I went through this big conundrum as a gardener.
Mhm.
Is it okay to buy plug plants from the garden centre, from the nursery? I'm not a real gardener because I haven't grown it from seed, and I felt really awful about it, but I did it anyway because it was so far ahead in the season that I was like, okay, I don't have enough time now, especially knowing that my seasons are quicker than normal. And it wasn't until I decided to have a few more flowers and pollinator plants in my garden that I realized that actually, if I just put them there, these insects will find me. And so that's when I started to have bees come and visit. I used to have hoverflies, which are my number one pollinator in my garden. Lots of different flies. I have both ladybirds and mannequin ladybirds. I got a plethora of different insects that will come and visit the garden. And I created some wildlife documentaries on my YouTube channel, just documenting some of the visitors to the garden. And I thought, oh my goodness, hold on. If I've got all of this on the 18th floor, what if there were more of these gardens across the city and we could create these wildlife networks, these wildlife corridors throughout the city? Manchester is very different to somewhere like London. Although London is big and sprawls far, it could technically be considered a forest, whereas Manchester doesn't have that. And so gardens like mine are probably really great resources for some of these insects that have probably been displaced by all of this urban redevelopment.
So I have to ask you about Sasha, your bee. Have you had any more Sashas?
And good old Sasha. Sasha taught me so much. So Sasha was a bumblebee who came to visit me every day around about 3 p.m. And she was hilarious. So I had obviously tons of different plants in this garden. I had lupins, I had salvias, and the one plant that Sasha went to first were these dandelions that I've just grown in my garden and some red campion. And these are plants that people associate with being as weeds. And, you know, the way I look at it is actually these are plants that bees are pre-programmed to visit. And, everything else that we have is a bonus for them. And so it got me thinking, well, in actual fact, if I had this platform and I encourage people to grow whatever they want to grow, that's not really helping the biodiversity. That's not really helping Sasha. If there were more balconies out there that had some wildflowers on them, that was probably going to be a better way of increasing biodiversity on the garden. So, although it sounds like a silly story, I actually learned a lot from little old Sasha.
I bet, absolutely. I think by the signs of it, gardening, being aware of who's visiting, what time are they visiting, what do they go to, what do they like. It's quite a mindful process.
100%. And I think when I think about huge issues like climate change, for example, I think that there is a way of negating climate change on social media these days. I think people will just label anything like that as woke,
Hmm.
and then that kind of just depletes everything. But what I found is that when you get people interested into gardening, all of a sudden you really care about the fact that your seasons have changed completely, or that you've seen less ladybirds this year, or that you've seen less bees. And sometimes it's that lived experience, it's that seeing things through your own eyes that you realize, well, actually, this has changed, and why has it changed? And then you look back through, the science behind it, and you realize, well, actually, maybe this is due to climate change. And so I try to use the platform to show people things like climate change or things like biodiversity without using some of the big words all the time,
Hmm.
and let people just find their own story and then come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of the language around these things can be quite alienating. But that's why I love community incentives like allotments or pocket forests or garden balconies, enabling people to actually have a stake in their environment because you observe more, you care more when you actually are given the opportunity to have that space and to be part of a chain of life.
100%. I've recently been named as a local nature champion for Manchester,
Ah.
where I'll be working with the local authority and the mayor's office to help shape
Hmm.
policy around the local nature recovery strategy, which is
Mm.
absolutely a phenomenal honor. And each one of the champions, I think there's 5 or 6 of us, we each have different experiences to contribute. So one of us, for example, is really big on community gardening. There's somebody else who's really knowledgeable about trees. Um, for me, it's the urban
Hmm.
landscape. It's showing actually what can be done in these urban settings, whether it's balconies, whether it's alleyway gardens, and also reaching out and working with developers to show developers what they could be doing to improve their green spaces that they create in their developments.
Hmm. And currently, how does it work with urban developers and how is biodiversity integrated or not integrated?
Yes, so I think what happens is there will be plots of land, and developers will come and take those plots of land, and they will be tasked with returning that some of that land, normally around about 10% of that land, back to nature, and they have to leave it better than what they found it.
Hmm.
And that sounds really great, but if they have taken on a car park, for example, an old car park that they have now redeveloped into a massive building, well, you only need to put in a little bit of grass and it's already 10% better than what it was.
Okay.
So, part of the challenge with working with developers is to make sure that rather than just doing a standard buxus or cord lines and laurels, that actually they include bed planting. And so that was the basis of one of the show gardens I did last year, and that was at the Tatton Park Flower Show.
Mm.
And it was about showing developers that instead of just using this boring car park planting, that is low maintenance. What they could do is incorporate some perennial plants in there that will be extremely low maintenance, that all you have to do is just chop back in spring. Um, and then there are other elements that I showed the developers that they could do, especially when you look at somewhere like a housing estate or even a tall building like mine where I live. Our community, our communal green space area is full of the usual, but I challenge the developers to say that they could, in essence, put an allotment space in the development because here in Manchester,
Hmm.
it's around about a 10-year wait for an
Oh my
allotment
God.
space. So if people had access to an allotment right where they live, A, the developers would not have to manage that because the community would do it themselves. If you have 8,000 people living across your two tall buildings, I'm pretty sure at least one person in that building will want to look after it.
Hmm.
And then you also get to bring a community together. And sometimes what happens with allotment spaces is people wait forever to get their space. And then once they have it, the novelty wears off, or the difficulty of traveling to that allotment
Hmm.
space to then use it puts people off going. But if it's right on people's doorstep, then people will be more keen to using it and it will probably have a greater impact on the building itself.
Totally. I absolutely agree. And I'm here for this because I'm waiting for an allotment. We need to talk about your RHS show garden. So you took your balcony garden to the Chelsea show as a way to show people how to use their spaces. And you also did this really interesting community alley garden after. I think it's interesting that you were 18 stories up when you started getting into gardening. Do you think that impacted the way you started to think about the possibilities beyond your garden for other people?
Yeah, I think that for me was something that was really apparent when I first started to see success on my garden and I first started to see the insects and wildlife in general come and visit my garden. And so it kind of dawned on me that actually, what if on the rooftops of all of these buildings there were containers like mine that were low maintenance that just needed a little bit of you know maintenance here and there? What if that was part of some kind of policy that actually, when we build these new buildings, that rooftops are included? That actually, when you design your buildings, that you include containers on the balconies already. Not every single one of these brand new developments, when they build balconies, not all balconies are able to hold the weight of containers. So some I've been able to watch this actually from my window. Sometimes the balconies are in essence clipped on to the building, whereas my balcony, for example, it's an extension of the flooring from my front room. So my balcony can hold the same weight as my front room. So yeah, I think for me, seeing having the view from my garden and seeing how the city constantly changes, it really got me thinking, well, actually, we need to be doing more about this. And I think when it comes to my show gardens, I always try to use them as a platform to advance where I'm at. So it's not just a PR opportunity where I get to turn up to a flower show and be on TV and all this stuff. There's real core messaging behind it. The Chelsea Flower Show Garden was my first, and that was my balcony garden called the Cirrus Garden, and that was showing people what a real balcony could look like, and it was actually just a replica of my very own garden. So it was very much based in realism, and I think that was part of the charm of that garden.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important for people to see what is actually possible, especially for urban dwellers. Like it's important to see a realistic representation of what is possible, especially for renters too. So your Tatton feature flower show was a community alley garden, which is really interesting. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
That garden was really special because alleyway gardening is something that we see a lot of in the Northwest, and it actually dates back to the industrial period. Manchester was the very first industrial city in the world, and we had a lot of terrace style housing. And so it's just rows and rows of houses together. and then there will be a small bit of courtyard at the back, and then there'll be an alleyway, and then there'll be a courtyard, and then rows and rows of houses. And so, and they used to be the homes for all of the factory workers. So the idea was to cram in as many people as possible in small spaces. And for us in the Northwest, this is normality for us. We see these alleys everywhere. And during COVID, a lot of people began to turn their alleyways into gardens and it became a communal space. And so I went out across the Northwest in search of some of the best alleys in the course of 3 months. And I learned so much from listening to these individuals about what the alleyway means to them, how it's brought the community together, but also some of the challenges as well. And I decided that I was going to relocate my alley to a community who needed it. And I found this one community, and they've been gardening on their alley for a good 5 years or so. But the problem, just like in most of these areas, is transient communities. So there's often a lot of students, social housing. People are not there often enough. And if you're doing a community project, but people are continuously leaving, sometimes people lose the umph to carry on. But these guys have been plowing on for such a long time that I thought, okay, if I'm going to give a 40 meter, which is huge, 40-meter garden to, uh, it needs to be someone that's going to maintain it. And so I was confident that this community would be able to do that. But I also felt that it was wrong to give somebody such a huge garden and then that's that. So I've also committed to mentoring them for the next 12 months as well, just to ensure that the garden is looked after and that the community is supported as they can be.
And how are they getting on with the garden?
Probably shouldn't say this, but the garden looks so much better in its home than it ever did at the show.
Really?
Yeah, and obviously a lot of the plants are growing out now, so the container's a bit more full. It looks wilder, and I think for me, what I knew, what I knew about the show garden was that it wasn't really about the show; it was about the future. And so I used the funding for the garden to buy community everything that they needed to make the garden successful. Interestingly enough, all the way through the garden, there were completely different ideas. So it looked like a complete mishmash. And to anyone who has not seen an alleyway garden before, this garden would probably have been really confusing. But the reason that everything was completely different in this garden is because when I did the consultation with the community, everybody wanted something completely different. Some people wanted to just grow herbs, some people wanted veg, some people wanted really pretty flowers that were pink, and some people loved weeds, some people love to upcycle. And so, if I was going to give this community this garden and ask them to look after it, they had to be invested in it. And so, I had to give them what they wanted, as opposed to giving them my version of what I wanted to make the most beautiful show garden and then dump this garden on these people. So, now now that the garden has really come into itself, it looks stunning and the community are using the space. And it's been a really amazing project to be a part of.
I bet, I bet. And I'm sure you've probably encouraged a lot of new gardeners. Did you have many first timers get involved?
I think that there's been such an outpour of people who'd seen the garden and thought, oh my goodness, I could do this. Because, I use things like a trampoline as a planter. We used bathtubs. We used upcycled items that had been fly tipped on this alley to make the containers. And sometimes with flower shows, you can go there and see the wonderful designs by the designers, but sometimes you can feel like, oh, I can't do that. Whereas this garden really showed, look, this is what you can do. Even if you don't have money, you can do this section. You can use whatever you can to make a container, and that is just fine. Just start growing. And I think a lot of people were inspired to get started.
So you intertwine your mental health journey into your gardening and online content. How has gardening transformed your life in that sense?
I think for me, gardening as a whole normally is that time where I will put my phone down and I will go out there and I will either go out, see new shoots, see new leaves, see so much joy from that, but also see how much life is intertwined into my little garden. And so I have worms, I have slugs, I have snails, woodlouse, there are ants, there are all sorts of different creatures that call my garden home. And sometimes I can just sit out there and watch them going about their daily life. And I just think, wow, how incredible is this? And so it's a real mood lifter. And in all honesty, that it, the mental health aspect is the foundation of everything that I'm doing. Because 3 years ago, before I started this garden, I had no idea on what gardening was like. It just wouldn't even have occurred to me to start gardening on the balcony. And because of this, I now have this garden. I have 150 or so house plants. But I've got all of these plants, and I felt the benefits to my own mental health. And I'm looking out my window now, and all I see are just a sea of these huge buildings with a lot of them with balconies. And I just think, what if somebody over there in that building over there needed something to help them with their mental health? What if this could help save their life? And so I think it's really, really important for me to not just do the work I do with social media, but also share this message with developers to make them understand, because not all of these buildings have balconies. Some of them just have a communal space down below. And there's a difference between walking through this communal space and actively being part of it and growing there. So I think it's really important to share this message for not just biodiversity but also for mental health as well.
Absolutely, 100%. And how have the developers responded to you? Oh,
It's been
no.
it's been a rough ride.
Okay.
The ones who I've worked with are great, and they've been really receptive. Um, and they will ask me to be part of their projects because they obviously want to learn and they want to do more. And I think for some, it started off as, if I'm being honest, it may have been a form of greenwashing, and I'm really conscious of this as well. And it's a really difficult line for me as a creator to straddle. Am I being part of a greenwashing program, or are people wanting to make change? And it's really difficult. But what may have started out as a greenwashing campaign, once I go through the metrics and the talking stages and the guiding stages, I then begin to see the passion from their side to think, oh wow, this is actually really cool. This is really important, and this can be really helpful to us. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if, for example, I am showing residents in their own complexes how to create these gardens themselves, what happens is these people become more invested in where they live, and they have a higher level of respect for their building, a respect for their apartment, and it only benefits the developer as well as the residents. So everybody wins. And I think that's what I've been able to do is use the platform to show developers, look, this is going to be actually beneficial for you in the long run. You might not see an instant gain, but you think about it in the long run, it's going to be better for you. And in that sense, when we do work together, it is an investment for you. And so that's how I've been making my way through them, and it has been working.
hmm Well, I'm extremely excited for that. As someone who lives in a very busy city like London, I am definitely up for it. So, what's next for you? What are you up to next?
I'm hoping to do some traveling over the next year or so. The aim is to go and learn what other countries are doing. So I will travel across Europe and Asia to figure out how other people have included green infrastructure into their cities, and then bring that back and see what we can do here in Manchester and see if we can implement anything into policy. But if I look at somewhere like Singapore, for example, they have got such amazing work, buildings and infrastructure, very green cities. It will be amazing to see some of that brought back here into the UK. But I also am extremely conscious that ecotourism is great for certain people and not for others. So what I don't want to do is say, look, we should do all of this, and then all of a sudden we've got this wonderful green metropolis, and then all of a sudden right next door you've got a town and city with nothing. And so it's making sure that everybody benefits. And I think oftentimes when it comes to cities, there's always one benefactor of everything, and it's normally not the residents. And so what I'm hoping to do is try to even out that playing field a little.
So we've come to our last question. So through your gardening in the past whirlwind 3 years, what is one thing nature has taught you?
Nature has taught me to not give up, don't give up on myself, because sometimes when I'm doing a lot, I sometimes have imposter syndrome, and I feel like, especially now when I'm working within horticulture, I don't have the same level of experience as some people. And I've had to learn, in essence, that the experiences that I've had over the past 3 years are actually important and they have value as well. And sometimes I forget that and I give up on myself. And what I've learned, just like I was saying before, is sometimes I need to put that work into myself to make sure that I'm the best version of myself so that I go out and champion all of the work that I'm doing. So, yeah, I think being resilient, if I was to sum it up, is a way that nature has taught me to be.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode of SUGi Talks, make sure you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to support more.